In this video, we're going to talk about the history of the US government's involvement in the drug trade, from the creation of the CIA to the opiate crisis of today. In 1996, a journalist named Gary Webb published a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News called Dark Alliance. His reporting laid out something that may surprise you. During the 1980s, cocaine had flooded into Los Angeles, fueling the crack epidemic that devastated communities across America. Webb traced that cocaine back to Nicaraguan drug traffickers who had direct ties to the CIA-backed Contra rebels. The money from those drug sales helped fund a secret war that Congress had explicitly banned. The series exploded. It was one of the first major investigations to spread online, and the Mercury News website crashed repeatedly from the traffic. Many had long suspected that the crack epidemic didn't happen by accident, but now there was finally documentation. Congressional hearings and investigations were demanded, but that's when the backlash came. The Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post all published takedowns of the report, insisting that Webb was jumping to conclusions. They said he had overstated the case. His editors buckled under the pressure and published a retraction that Webb himself refused to sign. He was demoted, reassigned, and eventually pushed out of journalism entirely. In 2004, Gary Webb's life ended under mysterious circumstances, and the details surrounding his passing are still debated to this day. 2 years before Webb died, the CIA's own Inspector General released a report that quietly confirmed the core of what he had written. The agency acknowledged that it had worked with drug traffickers, that it had blocked investigations, that it had looked the other way while cocaine poured into American cities. The report ran over 400 pages. It got almost no media coverage. So Webb was vindicated, but it didn't matter. His career was already destroyed, and his reputation wouldn't recover until long after his death. The Contra operation that Webb exposed was proven to be real, and it was barely scratching the surface. There was a clear pattern of alliances with drug traffickers that spans continents and decades and implicates the entire government. The pattern started in Marseille, France in 1947. World War II had just ended, and the Cold War, which I recognize as World War III, was beginning. The port city of Marseille was important to American interests because it was where U.S. aid flowed into Europe. The docks were controlled by powerful labor unions, and those unions were dominated by communists, which was unacceptable for the CIA. They wanted to break the communist hold on the Marseille docks, so they made a deal with the Corsican mafia. These were gangsters who had been running rackets in Marseille for decades. They hated the communists because the communist unions threatened their control of the waterfront. The CIA gave them money, weapons, and protection. In exchange, the Corsicans provided muscle to break strikes and drive the communists out of the labor movement. By 1950, the communist unions were broken and the Corsicans controlled the docks. The CIA got what it wanted, and so did the Corsican mafia. With their new power and protection, the Corsican mob expanded into a business they knew well: heroin. They set up laboratories in Marseille to process raw opium into pure heroin, and they used their control of the docks to ship it around the world. This was the birth of what became known as the French Connection. Here's how the pipeline worked. Opium was grown in Turkey, where it was legal for pharmaceutical purposes. Turkish traffickers moved the raw opium to Lebanon, where it was partially processed. From Lebanon, it went to Marseille, where Corsican chemists in hidden laboratories converted it into high-grade heroin. The finished product was then shipped to the United States, mainly through New York, where the Italian-American mafia handled distribution. The Corsican organization that ran this operation was led by the Guerini brothers, Antoine and Barthélemy. These were the same gangsters the CIA had funded to break the communist unions. Now they were running the largest heroin trafficking operation in the world, and they were doing it from a city where they had CIA protection. By the early 1960s, the French Connection was supplying somewhere between 80 and 90% of the heroin consumed in the United States. Tons of it every year flowing through this single pipeline into American cities. There were occasional busts, but for the most part, they could do whatever they wanted. The famous case that inspired the movie The French Connection happened in 1962, when New York detectives seized over 100 pounds of heroin hidden in a car. But for every shipment that got caught, dozens more got through. The big bosses in Marseille rarely faced consequences. The French connection finally started to collapse in the early 1970s. Richard Nixon declared his war on drugs in 1971 and put serious pressure on Turkey and France to crack down. We should talk about that for a minute, though, because the war on drugs wasn't what it claimed to be either. John Ehrlichman, one of Nixon's top advisors, admitted this years later in an interview. He said the Nixon administration had two enemies, the anti war left and black people.
We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did.
They couldn't make it illegal to protest, but they could criminalize drugs, which would justify a growing police state that could disrupt the growing anti war and black liberation movements. The war on drugs was never about public health, it was about political control. By 1973, the French connection was effectively finished. The labs in Marseille shut down, the Turkish opium pipeline dried up, and the Corsicans moved on to other businesses. By then, the CIA was establishing new partnerships in a region known as the Golden Triangle, a mountainous jungle where Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand meet. For centuries, the tribes living in these highlands have grown opium poppies, and after the CIA showed up, the heroin from these plants was making its way all around the world. Before we get into the drugs, though, we need to talk about why the US was in Southeast Asia in the first place. The official story is that the United States was defending freedom and fighting against communism, but in reality, it had nothing to do with freedom or ideology. Southeast Asia was one of the most resource rich regions on the planet, producing large amounts of rubber, tin, tungsten, rice, oil, and timber. During World War II, Japan had invaded the region specifically to control these resources. After the war, the United States didn't want to let them fall into the hands of governments that might nationalize industries or align with the Soviet bloc. When the communists took over China after a civil war in 1949, remnants of the nationalist army fled south into Myanmar, which was known as Burma at the time. The Kuomintang, also known as the KMT, was the army that lost the war. They set up camp in the mountains of the Golden Triangle and planned to someday retake China. The thing is, they needed money to fund their army, so they started selling opium. They organized the local poppy farmers, set up processing facilities, and built smuggling routes. Throughout the 1950s, the CIA provided weapons, training, and logistical support to the KMT, hoping they could be useful for destabilizing China. Meanwhile, North Vietnamese forces were using Laotian territory to move supplies down the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Vietnam. The CIA wanted to disrupt that supply line, but the US couldn't officially send troops into a neutral country, so they went covert. The agency recruited an army from the Hmong people, an ethnic minority living in the Laotian highlands. The Hmong had a long history of conflict with lowland governments, and many of them were willing to fight the communists. The CIA armed them, trained them, and directed their operations. At its peak, this secret army numbered around 30,000 fighters. They lived in the same mountains where opium poppies grew, and many families in the region had been growing opium for generations. So the CIA once again found itself in the drug trade, although this time they would be much more involved. The agency operated a private airline called Air America throughout Southeast Asia. Officially, Air America carried supplies and equipment for intelligence operations, but they were also carrying opium. Multiple sources have documented this. Alfred McCoy, a historian who wrote the definitive book on the CIA and heroin called The Politics of Heroin, interviewed pilots, agency personnel, and drug traffickers. He documented how Air America aircraft transported opium from remote highland areas to processing facilities and markets. The CIA knew. They had to know. These were their planes, their pilots, their operations. The agency has always insisted that they didn't directly traffic drugs themselves, but simply worked with people who did. This would be their excuse every time they got caught. While the agency was involved with opium production in Laos, heroin was flooding into Vietnam where American soldiers were stationed. By the early 1970s, military estimates suggested that somewhere around 15% of American soldiers in Vietnam had tried heroin, and many were addicted. The war in Vietnam ended in 1975, and Air America was shut down the following year. Next, the CIA would turn its attention towards South and Central America, where their alliances with drug traffickers became so brazen that a journalist named Gary Webb would eventually piece it all together. To understand this story, you need to understand what was happening in Central America during this time period. In 1979, the Sandinista Revolution overthrew the Somoza dictatorship in Nicaragua. They nationalized industries, implemented land reform, and aligned themselves with Cuba and the Soviet Union. The Reagan administration considered this unacceptable because it threatened the interests of U.S. corporations. So the CIA began funding, arming, and training a counter revolutionary force to overthrow the Sandinistas. These fighters became known as the Contras. Some of them were former members of Somoza's brutal National Guard. Here's where it gets complicated. In 1982, Congress passed the Boland Amendment, which banned the CIA from spending money to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. The Reagan administration decided to ignore this law. They set up a secret network to keep funding the Contras without going through Congress. Some of that money came from selling weapons to Iran, and some of it came from allowing the Contras to sell cocaine to U.S. citizens. Planes that flew weapons down to Central America came back loaded with cocaine. The drugs were sold in American cities, and the profits went back to the Contras. One of the key figures in this network was a pilot named Barry Seal. Seal was a former TWA pilot who became one of the biggest drug smugglers in American history. His base of operations was the Mena Intermountain Municipal Airport in rural Arkansas. During the years that Barry Seal was running drugs through the airport, Arkansas had a Democratic governor named Bill Clinton. Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, was deeply involved in the Contra supply operation through the National Security Council. Both parties had connections to the operations taking place at Mena. Multiple investigations into drug trafficking at Mena were shut down. An IRS investigator named William Duncan testified under oath that he was blocked from pursuing cases. Barry Seal was murdered in 1986, shot by Colombian hitmen in Baton Rouge. He was about to testify in a case that could have exposed the whole network. His death guaranteed that certain questions would never be answered. Barry Seal wasn't the only death connected to Mena. In August 1987, two teenagers named Don Henry and Kevin Ives were found on railroad tracks about 40 miles away. The state medical examiner said they'd smoked too much, fallen asleep on the tracks, and been run over by a train. Case closed. The families didn't buy it, though. They pushed for a second autopsy, and what it revealed made the official story impossible. One boy had been stabbed in the back. The other's skull had been crushed before the train ever touched them, making it apparent that they'd been murdered and placed there. The theory that emerged was that the boys had accidentally witnessed a drug drop connected to the Mena operation. The aftermath only deepened the suspicion. Several people called to testify ended up passing under mysterious circumstances. One was shot 3 times in the face. Another's body turned up in a landfill. A third disappeared entirely. No one was ever convicted. Meanwhile, the CIA was also protecting Manuel Noriega, the dictator of Panama. Noriega had been on the CIA payroll since the 1960s. He provided intelligence on Central America, helped with the Contra operation, and was mostly cooperative with the United States government. He was also trafficking cocaine for local cartels the entire time. And once again, U.S. intelligence agencies were well aware of what was happening, and they continued to work with him anyway. The U.S. government didn't decide that Noriega was a problem until 1988, when he was no longer useful and started to become less cooperative. In 1989, the United States invaded Panama, killed several hundred Panamanians, and kidnapped Noriega to stand trial in Miami. The invasion wasn't about drugs. It was about Noriega becoming less cooperative with American policy in the region. The drugs were just an excuse. All of this was happening while cocaine was flooding into American cities and creating the crack epidemic. The powder cocaine coming from Colombia was converted into crack, a cheaper, more addictive form that devastated Black communities across the country. The Reagan administration responded not by going after the traffickers they were protecting, but by declaring war on the users, imposing mandatory minimum sentences, 3 strikes laws, and mass incarceration. The same communities that were becoming addicted to the drugs the government helped import were then criminalized for using those drugs. This is what Gary Webb documented in Dark Alliance. The specific pipeline he traced went from Nicaraguan traffickers connected to the Contras through dealers in Los Angeles into the crack markets of South Central. The dealer at the center of Webb's investigation was a man named Rick Ross, who became known as Freeway Rick Ross. No, not that Rick Ross. The real Rick Ross that actually sued the rapper for stealing his name. Ross grew up in South Central Los Angeles and by the early 1980s was selling cocaine on a scale that nobody had seen before. At his peak, he was moving hundreds of kilos a week, generating millions of dollars. Ross got his cocaine from a man named Oscar Danilo Blandone, a Nicaraguan exile with ties to the Contras. Blandone was importing cocaine from Colombia and selling it to Ross at prices far below what anyone else could offer. The cheaper cocaine allowed Ross to undercut every other dealer in Los Angeles, which made him incredibly wealthy. What Ross didn't know at the time was where Blandone's cocaine was coming from and where the money was going. Blandone was part of the network supplying the Contras, and the profits from the cocaine sales were being funneled back to fund the war in Nicaragua. Ross was eventually arrested in 1996, the same year Webb's series was published. He was sentenced to life in prison under mandatory minimum laws, despite the fact that he was just a mid-level dealer working for people with government connections. Blandone, who had imported far more cocaine and who actually had ties to the Contra network, became an informant for the DEA and had his sentence reduced to less than 2 years. Luckily, Rick Ross's sentence was eventually reduced to 20 years, and he was finally released in 2009. He is now an author and a public speaker. The response to Webb's series tells you everything you need to know. The major newspapers attacked him not because his facts were wrong, but because his implications were uncomfortable. When the Contra War ended, the trafficking networks that developed during this time continued to operate, and the cartels that had been protected grew stronger. Meanwhile, the CIA was shifting back to heroin, this time in Afghanistan. This story has two chapters. The first is the 1980s, when the CIA armed the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union. The second is the 2000s, when the United States invaded and occupied the country for 20 years while opium production exploded. By the time American troops finally left in 2021, Afghanistan was producing over 80% of the world's heroin, and the networks that made this possible had been built with American money and American weapons. In December 1979, Soviet troops entered Afghanistan to support a socialist government that was facing armed resistance. In response, the CIA launched Operation Cyclone, which would become the largest covert operation in the agency's history. Over the course of the 1980s, the United States funneled billions of dollars in weapons and support to the Mujahideen, the Afghan fighters resisting the Soviet occupation. The money flowed through Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, which distributed it to various Mujahideen factions. Many of the commanders who received American support were also involved in the opium trade. The poppy fields of Afghanistan had been producing opium for centuries, but production increased dramatically during the war. The Mujahideen needed money to buy weapons and supplies, and opium was the most valuable crop they could grow. By the time the Soviets withdrew in 1989, Afghanistan had become one of the largest opium producers in the world. After the war, the country collapsed into civil war, which eventually led to the rise of the Taliban in the mid-1990s. The Taliban initially cracked down on opium production, nearly eliminating it by 2001. Then came September 11th. The American invasion of Afghanistan in October 2001 was supposed to be about destroying al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban from power. What it actually accomplished was the largest explosion of opium production in human history. At the peak of American occupation, Afghanistan was producing over 90% of the world's opium supply. Ahmed Wali Karzai, the brother of Afghan President Hamid Karzai, puppet dictator of the U.S., was widely reported to be involved in the drug trade. He was also on the CIA payroll. The global heroin supply expanded exponentially during the American occupation, contributing to addiction crises around the world. Meanwhile, back home, the opioid epidemic was accelerating. This is where the story gets complicated because the American opioid crisis has multiple causes. pharmaceutical companies pushing prescription painkillers, doctors overprescribing, economic despair, and communities hit by deindustrialization. The heroin flooding in from Afghanistan was just one factor among many. What's undeniable, though, is that American policy in Afghanistan contributed to a global heroin supply that helped fuel addiction at home. While American soldiers were fighting and dying in Afghanistan, the opium trade was flourishing under American occupation. The United States finally withdrew from Afghanistan in 2021. The Taliban returned to power almost immediately, taking over the country in a matter of weeks as the American backed government collapsed. After 20 years of occupation, trillions of dollars were spent, nearly a quarter of a million lives have been lost, and the result was the same people in charge who had been in power before the invasion. Since the Taliban has taken over, they have imposed harsh penalties for drug cultivation, drastically reducing the supply, but not entirely eradicating the trade. It's quite clear that drugs are an important part of U.S. foreign policy, despite the government waging a global war on drugs. In fact, some of the most notorious drug cartels in the world were actually trained and armed by the U.S. government. This story begins in the 1990s at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Fort Bragg is home to some of the most elite military units in the world: the Green Berets, Delta Force, the 82nd Airborne. It's where the U.S. military trains its best soldiers in unconventional warfare, counterinsurgency, and special operations. It's also where the United States trained the founders of what would become the most violent drug cartel in Mexican history. In the early 90s, the U.S. was worried about instability in Mexico. Drug trafficking was growing, and Washington wanted to help the Mexican military develop the capacity to fight the cartels. So they invited Mexican soldiers to Fort Bragg for training. The unit they trained was called Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales, the Mexican Army's elite special forces. These soldiers received the best training the U.S. military could offer: urban warfare, counterinsurgency tactics, intelligence gathering, weapons handling, and communications. The idea was that they would go back to Mexico and use these skills to fight drug traffickers, and that's not what happened. In 1997, a lieutenant named Arturo Guzman de Cana defected from the Mexican military and went to work for Ociel Cardenas Guillen, the head of the Gulf Cartel, one of the most powerful drug trafficking organizations in Mexico. At the time, Cardenas Guillen was in a violent turf war with rival cartels and needed protection. Guzman de Sena gave him exactly that. He recruited over 30 of his fellow GAFE soldiers to defect and join the Gulf Cartel as enforcers. These men became known as Los Zetas, named after their radio call sign. They were trained by the U.S. military, battle-tested in counterinsurgency operations, and now they were working for drug traffickers. There has also been suspicion that this was actually the plan all along. Before the Zetas, there was often violence between the Mexican cartels, but there were unwritten rules. They typically didn't target civilians, especially not women and children. The early cartels kept the violence relatively contained because violence was bad for business, but the Zetas changed everything. They brought military discipline and military brutality to the drug trade, taking out their rivals in some of the most brutal ways possible. The Zetas pioneered tactics that other cartels were eventually forced to adopt just to survive, like mass graves, car bombs, or attacks on journalists and police. By the mid 2000s, the Zetas had grown beyond their role as enforcers for the Gulf Cartel. They split off and became their own independent organization, controlling territory across northeastern Mexico and into Central America. At their peak, they were one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. The Mexican military was sent to fight them, which meant American trained soldiers fighting other American trained soldiers, with civilians caught in the crossfire. The official U.S. response to all this was to just keep training the Mexican military to fight the cartels. The Merida Initiative, a multi-billion-dollar aid package to help Mexico fight drug trafficking, poured more money and equipment into Mexican security forces, even as those forces continued to be infiltrated by the cartels. Some of that money went to train more elite soldiers, some of whose members would later defect, continuing the cycle. This brings us to Seth Harp's book, The Fort Bragg Cartel, published in 2025. Harp is a journalist and former Assistant Attorney General for Texas, who also served in the Army Reserve and deployed to Iraq. His investigation into drug trafficking and murder at Fort Bragg reveals something that the military has tried very hard to keep quiet. Elite forces at Fort Bragg didn't just train the cartels, some of them became drug traffickers themselves. The book documents a pattern of crime within America's most elite military units: drug trafficking, murder, and suspicious deaths, all connected to soldiers stationed at Fort Bragg who had spent a lot of time in Afghanistan. Harp documents cases of special operations soldiers involved in drug dealing on and around Fort Bragg. He traces connections between deployments to Afghanistan and involvement in trafficking networks back home. He writes about suspicious deaths that were never investigated and a culture where elite soldiers felt untouchable because they pretty much were. The Zetas commanders were eventually killed or captured, but only after years of carnage. The Mexican officials who had been on cartel payrolls mostly escaped prosecution. The American politicians who designed the training programs that created the Zetas faced no accountability at all. The soldiers Harp writes about either died under suspicious circumstances, received minimal punishment, or were never charged. The war on drugs has always worked this way. The people at the bottom, like the users and street dealers, are the only ones to face consequences. They are stuck in prison while the people at the top always walk free. The war on drugs was never about stopping drugs. It was about controlling who got to sell them and who got punished for using them. We don't have to keep doing this, though. We have decades of evidence pointing to solutions that actually work. In 2001, Portugal was able to successfully decriminalize drugs and has shown the world what a more compassionate drug policy could look like. Instead of being sent to jail, people who are caught with drugs in Portugal are referred to treatment. Since the policy was implemented, overdose deaths and infectious diseases spread through needle use has significantly decreased, and so has the number of heroin addicts. A person in the United States is 45 times more likely to die from a drug overdose than a person in Portugal. Portugal isn't the only evidence we have, though. Supervised injection sites, which are places where people can use drugs under medical supervision, with trained staff ready to help if someone overdoses, have been operating in Europe, Canada, and Australia for decades. The data on these facilities is overwhelming. Vancouver opened North America's first supervised injection site in 2003. In the area surrounding the facility, overdose deaths dropped 26% compared to the rest of the city. Barcelona's supervised injection site was associated with a 50% reduction in overdose mortality over 17 years. At an unsanctioned site that operated in an undisclosed American city from 2014 to 2019, there were over 10,000 injections and 33 overdoses. Every single overdose was successfully reversed with Narcan. No one has ever died at a supervised injection site, not one person. In facilities that have hosted millions of injections over decades of operation, the death count is zero. The economic case is just as strong as well. Every dollar spent on supervised injection sites saves money in emergency room visits, hospitalizations, disease treatment, and incarceration costs. A cost benefit analysis of a hypothetical site in Baltimore estimated it would generate nearly $8 million in savings at an annual operating cost of less than $2 million. These programs pay for themselves multiple times over. The war on drugs was never a war on drugs. It was a war on people.